In this video, I want to talk about an emerging term in the OSINT and internet investigation world. And it has a few different variations of how people say the term. So straight away, we're already in murky waters. Some people say 3i, some people say 3i's, some people say I. But essentially it's just 3i's next to each other. Now, this is a term that's sort of rising in prominence within the OSINT area, and it stands for Internet Intelligence and Investigation. Now, this term stems from UK law enforcement, and it's now the preferred term for open source intelligence research. And ultimately, I think it's a much more accurate term to describe what it is that someone is doing on the internet, and it's much more accurate than the term OSINT. Now, III or 3i or Internet Intelligence and Investigation differs from OSINT, and there are two main reasons for that. So firstly, 3i or III relates specifically to intelligence or information that has been captured via the internet. Now, open source can relate to any medium. It doesn't have to be the internet, it could be physical media such as newspapers or journal articles. So we're stating specifically that we are looking solely at the internet. And when people are saying OSINT these days, that's generally what they mean. They mean they're using the internet to find some information. Secondly, we're also highlighting that not all the information that we capture on the internet is open source. I generally break down the information available on the internet into 4 categories, all of which you would capture during internet intelligence and investigative activity. Now, I break these 4 categories down into open source information, quasi-open source information, quasi-closed source information, and closed source information. If we look specifically at what those are, then open source information is any information that you can find online without any form of payment or any restrictions on the access. So social media is going to be the primary example here. Anyone can create an account and access the data within the social media. So whilst yes, you do have to create an account, that isn't a barrier to access. Anyone can create it and ultimately get through into the social media site and see everything that's publicly available. You don't have to pay for it, and there's no restriction on who can and cannot sign up. If we look at the next category, which is quasi-open source information, this is information that has no restrictions on access, however, it isn't free. Now, I've sort of separated this from open source because there's a lot of discussion that goes on in the OSINT community about what is and isn't open source information. Some people think that even if you have to pay for something, it is still open source, whereas others will argue adamantly that the second you have to pay for something, there's a barrier to access and it's no longer open source. So that's why I've created this quasi-open source category. So systems here like Who You Investigate or GBG Can Access are systems that pretty much anyone can sign up for as long as you have enough money. So you can get hold of some really helpful data, which in these cases is going to be consented data. And the only thing that ensures that you can or cannot get that data is the cost of it. So if you can afford it, that data is yours. By having access to these systems, you could get someone's email address or their phone number, and also, all the addresses that they are associated with, those where they currently live and those where they have historically lived. So these aren't the only examples of quasi-open source systems. They're just the example that I'm providing in this case, but ultimately, any system where you can sign up and just pay a fee and then get hold of a bunch of data that is publicly available, then that is what I consider to be quasi-open source. On the other hand, we have quasi-closed source information. Now, this is information that has some restrictions on access. However, there are opportunities to access the data as long as you can gain the right permissions to it. Now, this can sometimes be free and it can sometimes be paid for. I don't necessarily think cost is the major factor here. It's more on the access permissions. There's a number of systems that are limited in use to law enforcement only, or very specific groups, say those organizations that are involved in investigating fraud. So to gain access to these systems, you have to prove that you are party of a group that is allowed to have access to these systems. However, they're available over the internet, and ultimately, as long as you are part of these groups, you can still gain access. So they're not closed sourcing themselves. They're not something only your organization can see, but they're locations or types of data that are very restricted in access to very specific groups. So my example that I usually give out here is Equifax. So Equifax allows organizations in the law enforcement sector to run checks against any subjects that they are looking at for a legal purpose. And you can search by name and date of birth and get any addresses that are associated with that person. And the records that they provide then allow you to see links to individuals that they live with, and you can get quite a bit of information about that subject. However, that's obviously quite invasive information, so they will only provide that access to law enforcement personnel, which is ultimately right. It's the right move to do. But it's not just the police that can access this, it's any organisation that can prove to Equifax that they have the right to criminally investigate or enforce law, and therefore there's a wide range of different organisations that can access this data. Similarly, a tool that came up last year called Clearview AI is a facial recognition tool. Now, originally, this is what I would have called a quasi-open source system, because they were selling access to anyone. So as long as you had enough money, which was a reasonable amount, you could sign up for Clearview AI and run facial recognition on any picture. And they had a data set which is made up of images from lots of different social media sites and is really quite a comprehensive database. However, privacy concerns were raised, and ultimately there was a whole series of events which included the selling of their customer list. However, the end result was that Clearview AI is now a quasi-closed source system. So only law enforcement have access to this database. So law enforcement still have to pay. However, the average private company can't sign up. You have to be able to demonstrate to Clearview that you have the right for that data. Data protection laws are in place to ensure that the everyday citizen has the right to privacy. So Clearview has to enforce this rule to make sure that they are only providing this very intrusive access on data to law enforcement individuals that have a right to search that data. Finally, closed source information. Now, this is any information that your organization holds the access rights to and is not available for public use. This may be information that only your organization can access, or it may be something that you share with a few other organizations, but ultimately it's one that your bosses or you control access to. We want to look at a system like SAP, or some may call it SAP, or Salesforce. So whilst there are lots of different Salesforce environments around the world, we're talking specifically about the Salesforce data that is available within your very own version of Salesforce. So the one that exists specifically for your organization. Now, this is available on the internet, and anyone with the permissions within your organization can search against it. However, if you're not a part of the organization, there is no way for you to search within this database unless you're, hacking into the system. So as an internet investigator, we are here relying on internally held data that is available via the internet, but only to your organization. Now, we'll restrict access on who can access this data within an organization to those who are appropriately trained and have the appropriate reason for searching that data. So it's very much closed to a set group of individuals, which are primarily going to be HR and security. We can't allow access to people outside of our organization or even everyone within our organization, because there's a lot of personal data that we will be sharing and we breach a load of legislation. So these sources are very much specific to just a set group of people, and You can rely on them as an internet investigator to give you a great starting point on where you then go. So, we might only hold the date of birth and the address of our employees, but that's enough to start doing an Equifax search, get a list of associates, potentially reach into where they have social media accounts, and then start our investigative work there. Ultimately, an internet investigator is responsible for collecting information from the internet from any type of source, regardless of whether that's open source, whether that's closed source, or whether it's one of the quasi methods that I've brought in. Collection of information using the internet is done within the law enforcement agencies by a trained internet intelligence and investigation specialist, as this ensures that it's done legally, ethically, and in a way that protects the law enforcement agency. For these reasons, I believe that any private organization doing internet intelligence and investigation work should be working to this same model. If your organization is collecting information via the internet and you're doing this as part of investigative activity, then I think it's crucial that this work is done by appropriately trained staff. If this activity isn't done appropriately, then you're opening your organization up to lawsuits from individuals who you are collecting information against, because you are potentially being intrusive and breaching their right to privacy. And ultimately, any information that you collect via the internet, if collected inappropriately, could be thrown out of court even if it's relevant, as if the appropriate methods aren't used. So it's really important that if you are involved with, or if your organization is involved in internet intelligence and investigation, then you have the staff that are appropriately trained to do that.